Corner or wide receiver, corner or wide receiver, corner or wide receiver. So Richard Sherman clearly ruffled some feathers on Undisputed when he told playmaker Michael Irvin and Keyshawn Johnson that cornerback is a tougher position than wide receiver, which got them in their feelings. And Richard Sherman, a former wide receiver recruit at Stanford, who then converted to corner, let them know why he changed his position to corner. And Keyshawn Johnson wrote a whole book on the wide receiver position being dependent on too many other things to go right, which Skip Bayless mentioned. So you've asked, at Richard Sherman why he changed his position, and he'll tell you he wanted the smoke. He wanted to be on the field for every down. If the defense plays 60 snaps, cornerback, you stand on the field for 60 snaps. Wide receivers, you can go out, you can switch it up. If it's a run play, you go to the sideline, catch your breath, get some water. All of these things that wide receivers can do to play maybe 45 out of 60 snaps. So, is cornerback a harder position? Does it take more, a different type of mindset to play corner than it does to play wide receiver? Do you have to do more studying playing corner than playing wide receiver? That's sort of subjective, but I'm in full agreement with Richard Sherman that corner is tougher for many reasons. But I also want to direct your attention to a tweet by the sports historian, Professor Lou Moore, in response to Richard Sherman's claim, where he said on August 29th, quote, "The race/history part of the debate about corner versus wide receiver is the fact that since the late 1960s, cornerback has been essentially all black because pro football leadership thought it required the least thinking of all positions." So, pro football leadership, do we agree with them? Do we even take them seriously? I would say no. And we know that football, American sports in general, has a racist history. Shout out to, and rest in peace, to the great scholar Orlando Patterson, and one of his famous articles where, there's this profound quote where some the first baseball team owners said, if you miss owning a plantation, you should own your baseball team. Something along those lines. I know I'm sort of misinterpreting his words, but it was something along those lines. But getting back on track with this conversation about cornerback or wide receiver, and thinking about Richard Sherman, let's just stay with Sherman for a second. One of the best corners of this generation. He was with all the smoke. I do remember the debates between him, Patrick Peterson, Darrelle Revis, three greats, about Seattle playing a lot of zone coverage, and I think that really ruffled some feathers with Richard Sherman, because soon thereafter we saw him shadowing the opposing team's number one wide receiver. For the majority of the game, there were some alignments where, against Calvin Johnson, for example, Richard Sherman didn't shadow him. Brandon Browner was there instead. But for the majority of the game, he was in one-on-one coverage against Megatron, one of the best wide receivers of all time. So just thinking about, what has to go into a cornerback's mindset when, studying a wide receiver who you're going to line up against for 90% of the game. You have to break down, you're really doing everything backwards. But to study that wide receiver who you're facing, you got to know their splits, studying film to know their strengths and weaknesses. What does this wide receiver like to do when the ball is on the far right hash? If it's on the far left, if it's trips alignment, if the receiver moves to the slot, am I gonna go inside, and who's gonna be to my left or my right? The communication that needs to happen. When the wide receiver's in the slot, do they like to run a slot fade? All these things. Is it going to be a run play? Is it going to be a sweep where the corner has to come up and make that tackle? Because not making a tackle on a sweep outside is almost equivalent to getting beat on a fade route. So all of these things has to go into somebody's mindset. And then, like I said, Richard Sherman what had to go into his mind when covering Calvin Johnson was completely different from what had to go into his mindset when he shadowed Antonio Brown. Two all-time great wide receivers, completely different styles, completely different measurements. Um, but he had a great outing against Antonio Brown, in terms of targets, yards, and a good outing against Calvin Johnson. And like he said, he wanted to dictate his own, fate in the sport. If you play in wide receiver, you're dependent on the quarterback getting you the ball. You're dependent on, the offensive line holding up. You're dependent on, if it's a team that's great against the pass but terrible against the run, then you're probably going to get fewer targets because it's like, why throw the ball 35 times when we can run the ball 35 times? So there's going to be fewer pass options, meaning fewer opportunities for that wide receiver to get the ball. But all of these things that goes into somebody's mindset when thinking about how difficult it is to play the cornerback position. And we didn't even talk about nickel position, which I would argue is the second hardest position in football after quarterback. The nickelback, I know that, especially in the modern era of Ray Lewis, he's given us he's the perfect example of the middle linebacker being the quarterback of the defense. But today's state of corners, looking around the league right now, people like Kenny Moore, Mike Hilton, there's so many good nickel corners in the league who are alphas. They dogs on their teams. And a lot of the playbook goes through them. Bringing it back to my team, the Raiders. Nate Hobbs has been moved back to nickel, which I believe is a good thing. He's aggressive. He's a good tackler. He plays the run well. So nickel being a quarterback of the defense. And having to know, any wide receiver can come to the slot and line up against that nickel back. So to think about the nickel who has to make sure that everyone is lined up, you can gamble, if you study and film so much. You are anticipating a run, you can shoot the gap, beat the oncoming blocker, all these things. And a trend that we're seeing now that we saw in the preseason is nickels being, the 4-3 linebacker, and in some cases also moving to safety. And I think this is the Chauncey Gardner-Johnson, the CJ Gardner-Johnson effect, where teams are seeing how effective he was with the Saints at nickel, and with the Eagles, he was leading the NFL in interceptions before he got hurt at free safety, and now he's off to the Detroit Lions. But a good example was the way that the Seattle Seahawks were using Kobe Bryant in a preseason. I believe Brian Baldinger is one person who broke down that alignment on Twitter. But I think that's going to be a trend. Other teams were doing it, but it didn't necessarily get the recognition. Like even my Raiders, Tyler Hall, his snap alignment throughout the preseason was all over the place, whether it was at backer, nickel, free safety, strong safety, moving him around. So just to think all of these different positions that a cornerback has to play to know where everyone else is going to line up, knowing their assignments, making sure that you do yours right. And it's a lot, man. Both positions are important, but this is a platform that, highlights DBs. And, I'm a homer, but I'm in full agreement with Richard Sherman that cornerback is a lot tougher to play than wide receiver. And, this is going to be a good year. We're going to try to see the matchups. It's a lot of corners who've been chirpy, and I love the joint practices. There was a good audio on YouTube that you can find with Baltimore Ravens Wired, which is one of the best, off-season, ongoing off-season on their YouTube channel. They won a ton of awards for it as well. But John Harbaugh was talking to Zay Flowers, telling him, "Hey, make sure you go up against Emmanuel Forbes a couple of times today." And the Washington football team had Emmanuel Forbes wired, him lining up against OBJ. But these young guns, they're not afraid of these top dogs. We saw Patrick Surtain going up against Devontae Adams, But even going back further, Marshawn Lattimore, I believe it was his first game in the league. He shadowed Julio Jones and had an impressive outing, and I think we're gonna see a lot of that going forward. And I think that I know it's all about one's mindset, but I do think that you gotta approach your defensive coordinator, your DB coach. You gotta show it in practice and show it in film study that you up for the challenge, and try to get their trust to let you line up against these opposing number one wide receivers, and give it your all. Go out there and make a statement. So we got the CJ Gardner-Johnson effect with, the nickel. Even going back further, maybe it's an Eagles thing. Signing Walter Thurman III, who was the nickel for the Legion of Boom, moving him to free safety, and he was leading the league in interceptions with the Eagles before he abruptly retired. But I think that's going to be a trend going forward, man. But yes, corner is definitely harder to play than wide receiver, and we gonna see it on full display this year. I'm looking forward to it. We're gonna see who with the smoke. It's a lot of young boys, and again, short-term memory. We're gonna have a segment called short-term memory. Who may have gotten beaten early in a play, but they came back and set the tone for their defense. They don't duck the smoke. They run up the chimney, as John Moran would say. But yeah, shout out Richard Sherman. He's great for TV. He's doing his thing on Undisputed, and keep on vouching for the DBs out there because it's needed, and they deserve to be paid like top wide receivers are paid too. So the next big dog, Pat Surtain II, I think he's gonna reset the market and is needed. Yeah, man, DBs, best athletes on the field, the corner. Peace.